would like to welcome you to today's nanotalk on sustainability, where we discuss how beneficial and harmful plastics and secondhand clothing are from an environmental perspective. So we have two speakers today, Magdalena Klotz and Maya Wieprechtiger, who will present their research. My name is Vanessa, and I'm going to be your moderator today. But before starting, the nanotalk is presented by REACH, which is a think tank by young scientists. And the overall goal is to enhance the relation between politics, science, and society. So the topics which are discussed within REACH range from digital change to responsible research or resources for tomorrow. So if you are interested in these topics and would like to know more about that, you can sign the newsletter of REACH, or even better, become an active member at REACH. So for more detailed information, you can go on reach.ch. or just pass by a social media account of REACH. So since the nanotalks will have a short summer break, and the next one is going to be end of September, you still have the opportunity to go to the YouTube channel of REACH and have a look at the interesting nanotalks that are online. So going to the nanotalk of today, we will have a Q&A session after the two talks, and if you want to connect to the speakers and interact with them, you can go on slide.do and enter the code nano-june, and there you can ask your questions. I will collect them and then hand them over to our speakers. So the first speaker today is going to be Magdalena Klotz. She's doing her PhD in the group Ecological Systems Design at the Institute of Environmental Engineering at ETH Zurich. Today she will present one part of her PhD, which is on the hated material plastics. So the stage is yours, Magdalena.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, for the introduction. Yes, we all hate plastics. Here you can see a picture that I took at a climate strike in Zurich, and you can see that people are demanding from Coop and Migros to stop using plastics. Migros tries to fulfill the wishes of its customers and works hard to reduce plastic in its packaging and replace it with other materials. There are even shops that do not use plastic packaging at all, like Chez Mamie at Schaffhauserplatz in Zurich. And on social networks, there are uncountable movements against plastics. So how bad is plastic? To start, I will give you a very brief introduction about this material, which actually is not one, but a number of different materials with very different properties. And there are problems related to plastics. Plastics end up in the environment. And this can lead to animals being strangulated or has other consequences that are very difficult to assess. From Switzerland each year, about 80,000 tons of plastic waste are exported. And they are partly exported to countries from which, again, huge plastic amounts are exported to countries with insufficient waste management systems. And so far, it has not been possible to trace whether Swiss plastic waste is further exported and might end up in the environment. Plastics also contribute to climate change. According to a recent study, 4% of the global greenhouse gas emissions were caused by plastics. And mainly the plastics production and incineration at their end of life creates greenhouse gases. Plastics can also have health risks. According to the study of a colleague of mine, up to 10,000 different chemical substances are used in plastics. A part of these has hazardous properties. For example, they are carcinogenic, mutagenic, or toxic to reproduction. And for a large share of these substances, the health properties have not been well researched. But what is important if we want to tackle these problems is to know what causes them. And what is also important is to know how big these problems are in relation to other human environmental impacts. Regarding plastics in the environment, in Switzerland, almost 2/3 of all plastics that end up in the environment stem from tire abrasion. The export amounts that I have shown you, for which the possibility that they end up in the environment cannot be excluded, they constitute only about 10% of the total Swiss plastic waste. And the rest is treated by the well-functioning waste management system in Switzerland. So if we reduce plastic packaging in Switzerland, this has no effect on the amounts of plastic in the ocean or in soils. If, however, we reduce individual transport and we use shared transportation or public transportation means instead, this does reduce the amount of plastics in the environment. Regarding climate change, only about 5% of the total oil and gas consumption is attributable to plastics. The rest is directly incinerated for heating and transportation purposes. So our plastics consumption contributes only a minor share to climate change compared to other human activities. So now I have put the problems related to plastics into a relation and tried to show you their main causes. But why do we even use plastics? Plastics allow for manufacturing a lot of useful products which would be difficult to produce from other materials. For example, functional clothing, household items, tools for which the electric insulation properties, for example, of plastics are very useful, smartphones, or medical applications. Compared to other materials, plastics can even provide environmental benefits. Plastics allow for fuel savings at transportation, for example, if they are used in passenger vehicles instead of metals, or if they are used for packaging. And this is due to their high strength to weight ratio, which allows to provide the same functionality at reduced weight, and thus to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. Plastics can also increase the lifetime of food, which is very convenient because it allows for food storage, and this again allows to consume the food in a different location than the location in which it was produced. And the substitution of plastics with other materials, which is nowadays often envisioned, does not automatically need to be environmentally advantageous. This is shown by this last example. A cotton bag, for example, needs to be reduced 50 to 7,000 times to be environmentally advantageous over single-use plastic bags. Now, what do I do regarding the topics I've talked about? The goal of my work is to reduce the environmental impact caused by plastics that I have shown you, in order that we can keep benefiting from plastics use, and I want to do that by increasing recycling. How do I want to do that more specifically? I am designing future plastic recycling scenarios for Switzerland with minimum environmental impact. And to become a bit more concrete, the method that I'm using is called material flow analysis. Material flow analysis always investigates a specific system, which is defined by a system boundary. And It consists of different processes which are connected by the material flows. In reality, a material flow analysis looks like this. My system was defined by products, plastic products that were used and arose as waste in Switzerland in 2017. And the processes that I've considered were all stages of the plastics life cycle. Here you have an overview of the material flows that I have considered more on a detailed level. I have considered all main application areas of plastics, and for each application area, I have included the main plastic types that are used in this area. And each application segment I further subdivided into a number of subsegments, so that in total I have distinguished 54 subsegments. And here you can exemplarily see the subsegments of the packaging segment. Here you have some results of this first part of my study. On the left, you can see the relative recycling rates of the different product segments. On the coordinate and on the abscissa, you can see the waste amount of each of these segments. You can see that we have the highest recycling rate for electrical and electronic equipment, followed by packaging, from which we also have the highest waste amount, which in total gives the by far largest amount of secondary material corresponding to this area here. And where this secondary material is used, you can see on the right side, you can see that the largest share goes back into the packaging segment. This is attributable to the fact that the PET drinking bottle recycling works very well in Switzerland and reaches high recycling rates, and the respective secondary material that is gained from this recycling can be used to produce drinking bottles again, which belong to the packaging segment. But also, for example, tertiary packaging films are recycled back into packaging films. A large share of the secondary material is also used in the building and construction segment, but also other product segments take up secondary material. And based on this analysis of the current system, I am now modeling different future scenarios for Switzerland, considering, for example, new sorting technologies, which allow for gaining secondary material with different properties. And this again might allow to use the secondary material in additional product segments than the ones in which it is used today. What are my conclusions regarding plastics consumption based on the work that I've conducted so far? I think we should use plastics sensibly. We should use plastics for purposes in which they are useful, and we should treat plastic waste appropriately. So we should prevent it from reaching into the environment, and we should recycle as much as possible, as recycling tends to be environmentally advantageous compared to other waste management options. To minimize the health risks, we should substitute hazardous plastic additives with non-hazardous alternatives where this is possible. And another aspect that I consider very important is that we should try to avoid inequality related to plastics consumption worldwide. So we should make sure that the environmental impacts that are connected to plastics production do not arise only in certain countries, while other countries only benefit and profit from plastics consumption. And we should also make sure that no workforce is exploited for plastics production. Here you have the name of the research project in the context of which I have conducted and I am conducting my work, the Clean Cycle project, and the names of my two supervisors, Melanie Haupt and Stephanie Hellwig. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Magdalena. So I already see quite a lot of questions, but we are first going to the second speaker, which is going to be Maya. She's also doing a PhD in the group of ecological systems design, and her PhD is on circular economy in Switzerland. And today she's presenting one project in her PhD. So the stage is yours, Maja.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, and also thank you, Magdalena, for your interesting talk. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. So I would like to talk to you about the loft trend, or whether buying secondhand clothes is actually beneficial for the environment. And contrary to what you might expect from this talk, I do not want you to go and buy more secondhand clothes, but I actually want you to stop buying clothes at all. And I hope by the end of this talk, you will understand how and why I come to this conclusion. But maybe let's start from the beginning and let's talk about why clothes matter. So we have here a graph from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, where you can see the increasing clothing sales and decreasing clothing utilization. So what that means, we actually use our clothes for a shorter amount of times, we replace them more often. Of course, I mean, this is also the fashion industry's business model. They encourage us to buy more clothes. So in fact, when a couple of years ago, the biggest brands had 4 collections a year, so every season, so spring and fall and so on. Now there is a new collection every week. So we are just constantly incentivized to buy more and more clothes. And this also has quite some impacts on the environment. The textile industry is actually responsible for quite some resource consumption, emits a lot of greenhouse gas emission, and there's also a contribution to microfibers in the ocean. So therefore, my colleagues and I, in a recent study, we asked ourselves, how can we actually reduce environmental impacts from clothing in Switzerland? And I will guide you through our study and also present you some results. So before we can actually think about how can we reduce the environmental impacts from clothes in Switzerland, we need to ask ourselves what is already there. So we need to assess the status quo. To do so, we look at flows and stocks. So what are the relevant flows in terms of clothes in Switzerland? Where do we have stocks? And we also need to know where are the environmental impacts so that we can actually see where do we have some improvement potential. Once we know whether and where we have some improvement potential, we can think of how can we reduce the environmental impacts. And we do this by designing what-if scenarios. So such a scenario could, for example, be, what if everyone just goes and buys secondhand clothes? What if everyone buys sustainable clothes? And when we are designing these scenarios, we actually have to take into account a couple of factors, and I will just highlight the most important ones here. So we have the substitutability, and the substitutability basically says to what extent can a new product be replaced? So to what extent can a new t-shirt be replaced by a secondhand t-shirt? Then we also need to account for whether people are actually willing to buy secondhand clothes. And we also need to look at rebounds. And rebounds, this could be a totally different talk, but just very quickly, rebounds are effects that occur when I save money, for example, if I buy a secondhand t-shirt, because it is cheaper than a new t-shirt. So if I save money, I can spend this money on something else. I can go eat something, I can maybe travel a bit. And I also need to account for the environmental impacts that occur through the saved money that I then spend on other things. So these are things I all need to take into account when I design my scenarios, so that I can then actually also calculate the environmental impacts of the scenarios. In a third step, we then compare the different scenarios to each other, and we also compare them to a baseline scenario. So the baseline scenario, or we also call it business as usual, is just a continuation of current practice. So it's basically, if we do not change anything, that's a baseline scenario. So in our study, we looked at environmental impacts, but of course you could also look at economic factors. You also need to account for social acceptance, technical feasibility, and also political implications, because in the end, what we want to do is come up with a strategy or a suggestion how we can actually reduce the environmental impacts from our clothing consumption in Switzerland. So let's have a look at the results from the status quo assessment. Bear with me, this is a material flow analysis, as Magdalena nicely introduced. We have the flows here, so this is the amount of clothes going into Switzerland and the system, and we have the processes in the boxes. So not to bother you with absolute amounts, I scaled the whole material flow analysis down to this flow here, and this is what we buy in Switzerland, or what we actually bought in Switzerland in 2018 in terms of clothes. So this is 100%, and everything else is relative to this amount here. So you can see when we start at the beginning that here we have quite some losses along the way. So we have losses during production, but we also have some losses during the retail phase, mostly due to damage that occurs by transport. And once we have the clothes in our closet, at some point we get rid of them. And actually the largest share of clothes is disposed of with just mixed household waste. So it is burned. Another big share is collected separately. And you've probably all seen these textile bins that are usually next to every other recycling station. And from the textile sorting, some part of the textiles are actually recycled into either insulation, so thermal insulation, or wipers. Another share is actually reused abroad, so mostly clothes are exported to Africa, but also another share is incinerated. And finally, from the textile sorting, quite a large share is transported abroad for another sorting, from where, again, clothes are either incinerated, reused, or recycled. I would like to also highlight the very small share of clothes that are collected for reuse in Switzerland. So this is done by these two companies here. And you can see it is just a very tiny amount. So now we know about the flows and the processes, but what about the environmental impacts? And of course, you cannot see it from this graph, but I did the calculations for you. And probably not very surprising that the garment production itself is the most impactful process. So this includes everything from growing cotton to producing synthetic fibers to making your t-shirt in the end. So this has, as expected, the highest environmental impact. What is also quite impactful is actually the use phase. And this includes washing and drying of clothes, which is very high energy intensive. So now that we know where we have some improvement potentials, which I marked here in purple, we can think about these what-if scenarios. So how could we reduce the environmental impact? And I would like to present you 3 of the scenarios that we developed here. The first scenario is actually a sufficiency scenario. Sufficiency is the idea of living with as little as possible. And we based this scenario on a German consumer study. So this German consumer study found that 50% of the clothes in our closet are worn 2 times or even less. So for this scenario, we assume that everyone in Switzerland would do just fine with buying only half the clothes we usually buy. I'm aware that this scenario is very ambitious and it is also very difficult to implement. Then we have a domestic reuse scenario, because remember, the talk was about secondhand clothes. So here we assume that instead of being exported abroad, clothes are rather reused in Switzerland. And the very decisive factor here is actually the substitutability. So the substitutability, just as a reminder, says to what extent can a new t-shirt be replaced by a secondhand t-shirt? Intuitively, we would assume that it's just 1-to-1. However, in other consumer studies, it has been shown that a secondhand t-shirt only replaces a new t-shirt in 1 out of 3 cases. In the other 2 cases, the t-shirt is just bought in addition. So it doesn't really replace anything, and it does not have any environmental benefits. In fact, there is even a negative effect because we consume even more clothes. In developing countries where clothes are currently exported to, this substitutability is a lot higher. While we save the transport impacts from exporting these clothes to Africa, we lose some benefits because we do not substitute as many clothes when we reuse them in Switzerland, as compared to exporting them abroad. So we will see whether there is a trade-off or whether we still gain anything from reusing clothes in Switzerland. Then, to tackle the problem of clothes in mixed household waste, we thought about a repair scenario. So there was this federal study who looked at household waste, and they saw that around 30% of the clothes that are in mixed household waste could be repaired. So repairing is usually not connected to a lot of impacts because you need a little bit of thread, maybe some electricity, and mostly time and knowledge. And it has also been shown that the substitutability of repaired clothes is really high, because if you are going to make the effort to repair your t-shirt or your clothing piece, it's probably very valuable to you. So we then compared these three scenarios to each other in terms of their environmental impacts, and we also compared them to the baseline scenario. And I will show you the results of this environmental impact assessment here. Again, I scaled everything to 100%, where I assumed that the impacts for the business as usual scenario are 100%. Also important to notice here is I'm showing impacts on climate change, so these are CO2 equivalents. So from this graph, you can see or not see the benefit we have from reusing clothes in Switzerland. So in fact, because we have this lower substitutability, because secondhand clothing is very often bought in addition and not instead of new clothes, we do not really gain anything in terms of environmental impact if we reuse them in Switzerland instead of exporting them. If we look at the repair and the sufficiency scenario, we do see some environmental impact saving potential. For repair, however, it's not as big as we would have hoped for, mostly because clothes are not thrown away because they're torn, but because people don't like them anymore, because they don't fit anymore, or because they're not fashionable anymore. So here it's just a little bit of savings. If you remember, the sufficiency scenario assumed that we would only buy half the amount of clothes that we usually buy, we can see there is also quite a drastic reduction in environmental impact. But remember, there's also quite a drastic change in consumer behavior. And I very much doubt that all of Switzerland would be willing to actually decrease their clothing consumption by so much. But we can see there is quite some potential. Interestingly, if we just quickly look at the rebound effects here, we can see that these are very little. So there is not much impact from saving 50% of the expenditures that I usually spend on clothing. And this is mostly due to the reason that clothes have very high environmental impacts per franc spent. So if I save the money, I most likely spend it on something else that has less impact per franc. So let's come back to my initial statement, what I want you to do and what we actually all can do if we want to decrease our environmental impacts from clothing. So as we have seen, the sufficiency scenario has by far the highest potential to reduce environmental impacts, but it is also the most unlikely to be implemented because it requires a lot of change. However, if you can, maybe you should just think about repairing your clothes. And buying secondhand is not bad, but make sure that you buy it instead of a new piece and not in addition. So I hope I was able to explain my initial statement and give you some food for thought. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion and to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Maya. So we have a lot of discussion already in the chat. I will start with one question for Magdalena. I think there are many questions on recycling regarding plastics. There is one question: how many times can plastics be recycled and reused? I think this is really broad one.
Yes, so this is difficult to answer in general. So what is important to know is that the plastic properties change when plastics are recycled, and this is due to the thermal impact on the material. So plastics consist of polymer chains, and these chains are modified if they are exposed to higher temperature. So for example, they get shorter or they get side chains. And these properties of these chains influence the properties of the material, of the plastic material. And this is why in general, the recycling compared or in contrast to metals, for example, is more limited because of this modification. So often when new products are produced using secondary material, a mixing takes place of primary and secondary material, and then there's a dilution, and so it's hard for me to say a number, or I would not like to say a number, but I think that is not one of the main limitations of recycling, actually, of plastics recycling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So then I have one question for Maya. The question is, do the microfibers in the ocean come from the production or also from us washing our clothes?
That's a very good point, yes. I do not know the shares, but there is definitely some microfibers coming from the washing and the drying process. So yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So going back to the plastic recycling, well, it goes hand in hand because of the cotton bag. One asked, the cotton bag needs to be used 50 to 7,000 times to be better than plastics. Why is there such a huge range?
Yes, so these two numbers correspond to different environmental impacts. So if we only consider the effect on climate change, then the number according to the study that I'm referring to is 50. So if we only look on the climate change impacts of the whole life cycle of the cotton bag compared to the plastic bag, but the 7,000 result if we look at all different environmental impacts. So there is, besides the impact on climate change, there are environmental impacts, for example, on land use, on water consumption, acidification. So there's a number of different impacts that are considered in environmental studies. And if we regard them all, then this very high number results according to the study.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Then, because you explained it, Maya, you explained the rebound effect, and someone is asking if you could explain a bit more how you quantify the rebound effect.
I would rather not do that because this is a model from a colleague of mine, and she's working really hard on her publication. So I will refrain from answering this question further.
Okay. Then we have other questions regarding the recycling of plastics. First of all, how energy intensive is the recycling, and what are the limits of the use of recycled plastics?
Mm-hmm. So the energy consumption is definitely minor compared to plastics production, for example. So from that point of view, if we manage to substitute primary plastics, that is usually environmentally beneficial. Again, this depends, the exact amount depends on the plastic type, for example, because they have different melting points, etc. But it's definitely not extremely high. Now I lost a second.
What the limits are of the use.
Yes, thanks, of the application of secondary plastics. Thanks.
Yeah.
So that is exactly what I have worked on recently. So I had in my study investigated in which products secondary plastics are used, and they are usually quite limited. So the applications of different secondary plastics are usually limited. So it depends on the recycling process they stem from, for example. So as I've said before, the PET bottles, the secondary material of those is used again for producing PET bottles, and PET bottles can even be produced of 100% secondary material. But for other plastic types and recycling processes, sometimes, for example, the secondary material cannot be used in food contact applications because it cannot be ensured that no hazardous substances are contained. So these can stem, or they can already be contained in the plastics. As I have shown you, there are hazardous substances that are used in plastics that provide for certain functionalities. So for example, they provide for flame retardancy, which is very useful for electrical and electronic equipment, for example, or for building and construction applications. But we need to make sure that these plastic additives do not end up as secondary plastics in food contact materials, for example, in food contact products. And the reason, so one of the main reasons why this limitation exists is that the huge or the large variety of plastic products in our world, about which I have also talked. So there are different plastic types, but even of one plastic type like PP, there is uncountable different configurations, different grades they're called, and then there's these 10,000 additives that are used, and you can imagine how many combinations can arise from these. So there's this huge variability, but when we recycle plastics, we cannot, of course, create 20,000 different recycling streams. So there a mixing of different plastic types takes place. And this is one main limitation of recycling, that then the secondary material does not have that specific properties anymore, and so it does not fit certain products. And this is what I have investigated in a study, whether if we increase recycling, we could use all the secondary material in product manufacturing, or whether this poses a limit to recycling.
Thanks, Magdalena. Then going back to the second-hand clothing, there's one interesting question: how much does the quality of clothes affect their environmental impacts?
That depends on how you define quality, right? I mean, if we assume that high quality clothes have more fabric on them, so then it would just be proportional. But what we have also seen is that the lifetime of clothes does not really correspond or correlate to the quality. So people get rid of their clothes before they tear, before they break, and not because, I mean, of course, sometimes you have pieces that just fall apart after washing them 2 times, but in general, people just get rid of them because they don't like them anymore, because they don't fit anymore, because they need, also very often given the reason that they need more space in their closet for new clothes. So I guess quality is not really the issue. And I think I see the thought process behind the question, like, does it make more sense to buy high quality or qualitative high clothing? I guess yes, if you really keep it until it falls apart, and then it makes sense. If you're just going to replace it anyway, like you do with your cheaper clothes, then I guess it does not really make that much of a difference.
I have one question for you, and it's again a bit on the rebounds, but not too much, so don't be afraid. How are rebound substitutability and willingness to participate modeled or measured? And isn't rebound made even worse if you don't buy any clothes at all anymore?
So I'm okay. Modeled. So because we look at Switzerland as a whole system, we have to make assumptions about like the substitutability, for example, and we refer to other studies that have specifically looked at, well, substitutability of secondhand clothes in developed countries. And from there, we take this number of 33%. And then we can make assumptions about what are even the clothes that would be available for direct reuse. There's also estimates about what share of the clothes that are being disposed of could be reused. So that excludes everything that has a hole in it or like stains or things like this. And then from this, we can actually see, okay, from this amount, we have 1/3 that replaces a new clothing piece, and everything else is just in addition. So we can then give some credits for this 1/3 that replaces new clothing. And it is very similar with the consumer behavior or with the consumer willingness. Also there, social scientists have conducted studies about the willingness of purchasing secondhand clothes, and it is generally quite high. For other products, it is very low. For example, mattresses, which I personally also feel rather not so willing to buy a secondhand mattress, but for clothes, it's really high. So we can then, we can see whether the demand and the supply of secondhand clothes actually correlates or where is the limitation. And then from rebounds, we'd have to make, so maybe I can give a bit of details about the rebound model. So it assesses or it includes different household types. It includes income, household size, and all these things. And so we can make assumptions about what kind of measure would lead to what type of saving. So if we say we only spend 50% on clothing, we have a saving of 50%. And then we also need to include the fact that many times people do not directly just spend their money, but they save it. So there is like a delay in these rebound effects. Yes, so that's, I hope this answers the question.
I hope so too. Magdalena, why are most non-bottle plastics, so I assume everything else than PET plastics, not collected for recycling in Switzerland?
So that is not true first. There are some more things that are collected that we maybe don't think of or don't know of. So there is, for example, from non-consumer packaging, these films are collected, and other products from building and construction. There are collection systems for window profiles, flooring or roof lining, and also for electrical and electronic equipment. We have very high collection rates actually, and they also contain relevant amounts of plastics. Also, plastics in vehicles are collected, but then almost not recycled. But anyways, large shares are also not collected. And I think, again, the technical reason why it is difficult to recycle them is, I think, what I said before, this large variety, and this complicates recycling. And if recycling is difficult, then of course we don't even collect these items separately, but we incinerate them or use the energy, for example. Also, again, because plastics, for example, use only a minor share of the total oil, so we don't save a relevant amount of oil maybe if we recycle them, but maybe there's other reasons that are more important for plastics recycling. And yeah, I think as with everything, what in the end decides is the cost. So it's just often too expensive to recycle the plastics, and we do at the moment not pay for this. So for electrical and electronic equipment, for example, there is this, as you probably know, advanced disposal fee, vorgezogene Entsorgungsgebühr in German. And this finances the recycling. But if such is not paid by the production company and in the end by the consumers, then of course no economic stakeholder is willing to collect the waste if they operate in an economic way. So I think we would need political incentives here or regulations if we want to change something.
You said that a lot of plastic is incinerated. someone asked, why does Switzerland even export tons of plastics per year? And where does it go? I mean, I think you already mentioned that it's not really sure where it's going, but still the question is, why does Switzerland need to do that?
Yes, that's a good question. So, as I said, it's a minor amount, first of all. So the biggest shares are treated in Switzerland and are incinerated here. I could imagine that this is, again, has economic reasons. And as far as I know, this does not regard waste from households, plastic waste from households. Where it is exported, we know the first countries where it is exported to, and this is mainly the neighboring countries, mainly Germany, over the last years. And there, for example, also recycling of Swiss plastic waste takes place because, for example, at the moment in Switzerland, we do not yet have a sorting infrastructure for mixed plastic waste. But then also a large amount, fifth largest or so, this is visible from the export statistics from Swiss Impacts, and a large amount goes to the Netherlands, for example, and there we have the biggest port in Europe, so it might be, of course, that the plastics are further exported from there, but so far the exporter does not have to declare, especially if he doesn't know or her, where the plastic waste will go afterwards. It's not so strict to declare this, but there has been a change with the Basel Convention. So now more information will need to be declared on the further destiny of exported plastic waste. So this might change something regarding this situation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then one question for Maya. Just like a ping pong game here. I like that one because it's kind of regarding the fast fashion thing. So could one just make efforts to make or keep old clothing styles fashionable and popular?
That's an interesting thought.
Right.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I guess if we would try to slow down how fast fashion changes, then people wouldn't maybe feel the need to change their wardrobe so often. And then, of course, if we keep our clothes longer, we replace them less often. So then the overall production would reduce. But I guess this goes against every business model in the fashion industry that is really just selling as much as possible. But yeah, I very much like the idea.
Yeah, me too, actually. But when we are already talking about the textile industry, H&M presents itself to be a sustainable company. And now they are advertising that they are recycling, that they have a recycling project. So they are taking back the old clothes. Would you say that this is a good start for the clothing industry, or?
Well, I guess many of the recycling problems Magdalena just mentioned are also very true for textiles, because you rarely just have one material in a t-shirt. Well, it exists, but in many cases, clothes are made of a mixture of fabrics, and it is impossible to separate the different fabrics. And then you have the fiber lengths differ, and then it is basically, well, impossible, or it's just very difficult to recycle or getting fibers back out of t-shirts. So there was again a German consumer study, or a German study, where they investigated what happens to these collected clothes, and most of them are actually incinerated. Some of them are donated to charity, which I think that's a very good thing. And there is also this recycling into wipers. Of course, this is recycling, but I guess the promise is rather recycling back into textiles, which is not really happening at the moment. And also what the study found, which I think is probably the worst part about this whole incentivization thing, that people need to go to H&M stores to dispose of their old clothes. And then they get a coupon. And what do? They buy more clothes. And so it is basically a bit greenwashing your own conscience. And I think it would make more sense to donate your clothes to one of the companies I mentioned that actually gives the clothes to people who need them, to Caritas, to Teltex, or bring them to like a Brockenhaus or something like that, than actually bringing them back to H&M.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. So would you say that it's good? Is it good enough in terms of environmental impacts to buy cotton-only clothes? Because I mean, there are a lot of plastics in clothes as well, right?
Yes. So cotton clothes have their very own environmental problems, and I think the plastic bag versus the cotton bag example from Magdalena very nicely illustrates that. So cotton is very water intensive. It is very often farmed in places where there is water stress. We need fertilizer and so on. Whereas we can use recycled fibers from PET, for example, to make rain jackets and so on. There, on the other hand, we have the problem of the microplastics, which is not really assessed well enough yet. So just buying cotton is not necessarily better than buying synthetic fibers. And again, it very much depends on which environmental impacts you want to look at.
Mm-hmm. There is one question regarding your analysis. How did you consider cotton versus other materials in your study?
Okay, so we also looked at the import statistics of Switzerland because, well, 99-point-something% of clothes are actually imported to Switzerland. There's very few, or there's basically no production in Switzerland. And from there, we had an estimate of what is the share of cotton and what is the share of polyester or just synthetic fibers. And then the environmental impacts are calculated accordingly. So we have a share of clothes that we cotton clothes where we calculated the environmental impacts, but we also have the other clothes that are made of synthetic fibers that undergo different life cycle stages or have other production processes. And so we distinguish between these two types of clothes. But of course, it's in simplification because we just assume two types of clothes and there are many more.
There are many more, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good. Well, going back to the recycling, I would say, this is an interesting one because you already mentioned that there are like so many additives in plastics. And I think it might be hard to answer, but still, how clean has plastic to be for good recycling and how well does it need to be sorted?
How clean it has to be?
Yeah.
Again, difficult for sure to say in general. So because of course the health effects vary largely also. So there's different health effects and they're of the different additives, and also as we have seen even in new plastic products, we do not at all know the health effects of all additives that are used. I think it is hard to say, and it is also hard to measure because usually we need to know before what we want to measure, and then we can measure a specific substance. So we cannot just measure if a secondary material flow is clean, for example, but we can see if it contains bromine, but we cannot measure it for all. So we can, for example, make certain regulations for what can be used in products, and we have such regulations, the REACH, for example, on the European level, which regulates which chemicals are allowed to be used. And of course, there it's not that we do not know which chemicals we use in products, so there is a process for allowing them to be used, but still sometimes we find out later that a certain substance has health effects. So for some streams, for example, we know that they contain hazardous additives, and if we know that, that is the goal of our project, what the name already says, Clean Cycle, we try, or we aim for sorting out these plastic waste streams if we know that they contain hazardous additives, which again is more the part of my colleague Helene Wiesinger, who is investigating and measuring this. Yeah, and in general, of course, food packaging, for example, has higher requirements already for the additives that are allowed to be used. So here maybe we can be more sure that we do not create problems if we recycle this. But at the same time, recycling does not only modify the polymer chains, but also the additives, or it can modify the additives. And so it can also be that we create hazardous substances during recycling. So yeah, each process basically needs to be studied, which again, yeah, makes it complicated.
All right. I think we are coming to an end. So now I have a general question for both of you. Magdalena, would you say that we are going in the right direction in terms of recycling of plastics in Switzerland?
There is definitely a lot going on regarding plastics recycling in Switzerland. There is many postulate, so political motions to promote plastic recycling. I think we are sometimes not aware of maybe of the environmental consequences of recycling of plastics, and also of the variety of plastics, or of the barriers to plastics recycling. But I think there is a lot of options, at least at the moment, to bring in scientific knowledge. And as I said before, we do not yet have a sorting facility for mixed plastic waste. I think this is a huge opportunity to create a suitable sorting facility, which might allow, for example, to more specifically sort the plastic waste, and technologies for this exist. They have been studied since a long time. So yes, I think we have the possibility to go in the right direction. Let's put it this way.
No, that's a positive last statement of you. Maya, for you, would you say there are currently incentives to impede the fast fashion industry, or do you see an increase of sustainable second-hand clothing in Switzerland?
I feel like clothes have only just quite recently received enough attention because of its environmental impact. I think that there are quite some social impacts that people were aware of, but environmental less so. But there are a couple of initiatives have started to actually look at environmental impacts from clothes, and are also trying to reduce them on a global and also EU level. And also in research, there are some efforts trying to actually make textile recycling happening with new spinning processes, new sorting processes. And I think there's also growing awareness within population. There are clothing libraries, there are exchange events happening. And although it might seem like I'm an opponent of secondhand clothing, I still think it is a good thing to buy secondhand clothes if you're aware of the implications. But I think there's still a lot of room for improvement, although we're taking teeny tiny steps in towards the right direction.
Yeah, nice. So we have quite two positive statements at the end of our nano talk. Yeah, I would like to thank you for your attention with really nice discussion for the last Nano Talk here in this semester. And yeah, have a nice evening and see you in September for the next Nano Talk.
Thank you very much, you too.
Yes, thanks a lot.
You're welcome.